Hey, Sitaram Dass. How are you
Hi,
doing today?
I'm good, man. Yeah, how you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm like really excited to chat with you. I've been following your work for a while, and I'm sure we'll get into some of it, but I've been really looking forward to this conversation. So thank you for spending some time with us. And yeah, I wanted to kind of start this conversation on the topic of passion. So I want to ask us to like go back in time a little bit in the story of Sitaram Das and maybe even to childhood or young adulthood, if you're comfortable talking about around this topic of passion. Like, I'm wondering if anything comes up, if you reflect back on things that like gripped you from a young age, like something that you can remember, like that really was like this thing is like really, really interesting or gripping my attention.
hmm
And I'm feeling passionate about it, maybe. Can you remember any like early in the story of Sitaram Das, that any early experiences like that you'd be willing to share with us?
Sure. Well, what comes to mind? There's different ways that we can think of passion, right? There's
Yeah.
like moments of passion, this intense emotional energy, but what's coming to my mind right now is thinking of passion is like really feeling for something strongly enough that you're willing to make a deep commitment to it.
Mm.
And uh, you know, two things that really pulled on my mind and my commitment, and that I spent a lot of time doing because of that natural passion when I was very young. One, I have a memory at a pretty young age, like elementary school, and it definitely carried through middle school and high school of spending hours just shooting hoops in
Mm.
my neighborhood. I lived on a cul-de-sac, and there was a basketball hoop there, and it wasn't mine. It was another neighbor put it up, but just like community basketball hoop for the block, and I would spend hours out there just shooting hoops. Sometimes I'd play with other people, but the fact that I could be doing that by myself and that I would be just fully engaged and captivated by it, and it didn't feel hard, right? It's just that's what I wanted to be doing with my time. But the other big one is music
Mm.
for me in terms of really experiencing passion on all levels of it beyond passionate feelings towards like girls, right? Being young,
Yeah.
right? Puppy love. But really music, just listening to music, discovering music for the first time. And that actually, in a way, I didn't have the words for it, but it felt like a spiritual experience, right? Putting
Mm.
on headphones and sitting in my room and listening to some of these songs and discovering them. But also playing music. Guitar was big for me. I took guitar lessons when I was pretty young, around 8, and that carried me through middle school. And I stopped taking lessons in high school, but that's also around the time when I became even more passionate. Right, I discovered scales and the blues, and I would just sit in my room and play guitar, for hours, and just completely satisfied by that, and just have time pass by. So music was a very early passion of mine. Absolutely.
Wow, that's so awesome. Thanks for sharing those kind of early experiences. And uh, yeah, so there was this. First of all, I loved how you started by kind of like almost define like how can we look at passion. That was really interesting. And I think you made a cool point about something that pulls on us enough that we really commit to it and want to spend time doing it, just kind of naturally. And for you, like two things that you remember early on are hoops, playing basketball. And I really resonate with that one because as I was thinking about this question, I was really drawn in by soccer. I loved playing
Hmm.
soccer growing up. Just love that sport. And then also with you, you got really into music and playing music. And that's interesting. I mean, I wonder what you think of this. I was trying to think of one reason I asked this question, Cedar Ramdas, is I'm looking for like this kind of intuitive, like archetypal theme that might follow us through the interview, and something that kind of we can circle back to. And I love this idea. I was thinking of similarities between sports and music. And I wonder
Hmm.
what you think about this. Both sports and music have this very interesting dance between the routine, doing things again and again, and these just little surprises that happen that are just delightful. You have like some kind of melody, and then you break into something new, and it's like, whoa, that is so cool. Or you're playing basketball and then someone dunks and you're like, dang, that was freaking awesome. Like that they did this. And there's like boundaries to them, but within those boundaries, like these delightful emergent things happen. And I was connecting that with the topic that you could probably tell us about, like Leela in the spiritual traditions, but there's like a playfulness to both of them. And I'm wondering if if you connect with any of that little ramble.
Well, I think that there's a core human need of experiencing absorption,
Mm.
right? Of being absorbed in what we're doing. And I think there's another need of being able to have a spaciousness of mind, right? Just allowing just free awareness of whatever pops in, which is different than when we're really absorbed in something. And those are core human needs. And there's a lot of ways that we go about experiencing them. You know, the reason why we binge Netflix or whatever it is because it's meeting a need of we can be absorbed in something, we can be absorbed in a story, and you can say the same thing about a lot of things, right? And obviously, we're aware that some of those things are going to be healthier than others in terms of things that we can absorb into, but all of them are granting that need, right? And sports and music are two elements where, in the modern lexicon, we talk about flow states. And those are both elements where we can experience that flow, right? Where if you're an athlete and you're competing, just you have to be so absorbed and so turned on that the rational thinking mind kind of just falls at the back, and it feels like you're just in a state of flow and things are just happening, and it's like decisions are even being made quicker than you can think them normally. And it's the same with music, right? Where you get so tuned in, it's like you're just a part of the music, and it's like you and the band become one entity. And any musician or athlete, no matter what level you play on, we've probably experienced that to some degree. And most people have experienced that to some degree in some element in their life, whether it's through sex or whatever it is, right? There's these elements of experiencing flow states, of experiencing absorption. So it's a core human need, and those things do fulfill that. And one way that we can view the spiritual path is when we start to recognize that we don't need external aids to experience that absorption, that core human need doesn't have to be dependent on something external at all. And that actually gives us a framework for determining if we were to create a list of hierarchy of like things that are healthy or not healthy in terms of ways that we seek out absorption. It kind of gives us a way to map that out in terms of, is something making us dependent on that? And is it making it harder for us to experience that outside of that? Right? Or is this particular activity actually training our minds so that we can experience more presence in our life? Right? More presence, more awareness. And then even more than that, the spiritual teachings say that at the core of our being is perfect loving awareness, right? That we are self-satisfied. And when we know that, well, then we specifically pick out things to experience that absorption in that ultimately are going to make it even more apparent that what we are absorbing into is our own being. Yeah, so that's how I see those things tracking along with the spiritual path.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. A lot there. Just to summarize real quick, make sure I'm tracking with you. So that's very interesting. So first we have this idea of absorption, which was very gripping to me, and I might circle back to absorption here in a second. But then and then we have this concept of like flow states, which like playing music is fairly difficult. There's like some friction, and so it requires a little bit of effort. But you can like master it and you can get good at it. And that feels like really, really good to find that like sweet spot of something that has some tension, but you can like find some flow state. Another thing that came up when you were talking about both sports and music, when you brought in the concept of the band, is they can also be with other humans too. They're related in like a community, which is pretty intriguing idea. Then we've got this other thing, which is recognizing that this absorption in this flow state can that maybe these external things are almost like, I want to say like a means to an end, if the end is the recognition of like our true nature of love. And maybe when things can be less healthy are when they're kind of appearing as an end in of themselves or something like that. And of course, I'm very interested, and we were talking a little bit before we came on, in addiction. So I work with addiction in my own life. I can really resonate with that, in the kind of horror and despair of realizing this thing is no longer creating absorption, is creating suffering, but I don't know where to turn next. That kind of sucks to figure that out. But it is, the good news is, discovering something like a meditation practice or a chanting practice that is an external object, but it points more readily to that. And it just seems, I don't know, my tolerance isn't going down, or my tolerance hasn't gone up for chanting too much yet. I mean, it's still a good external thing for me that I'm good with. Yeah, that framework is also really, really intriguing me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting, right? Because also when we recognize that about addiction, and I have my own past with addiction, when we can also get in touch with the fact that it is serving a core need, right? Like we do it for a reason, then it also points to, right? It's often not just enough to just stop it, right? We have to find some way to fulfill that need, right? And so when we can get in touch with the suffering and the damaging it's causing, but also like really get in touch with the reasons why we're doing it, then that points to a way to build a new life. But also what came to me as you were sharing this is really common when we get into the spiritual life, whether it's because we're coming off of addiction or we just got present with some level of suffering in our life. It's not always this, but often for many of us, if not most of us, that's what launches us into the spiritual path. Often the way that the practices that we choose to do and the way we relate to those practices, often in the beginning, it's about seeking other means of essentially experiencing that high, right? Of having us feel good and learning that those good feelings are less dependent on exteriors. And that's a powerful practice. But somewhere along the way of the spiritual journey, things shift a little bit, because ultimately what we realize is that if this really is our true nature, if contentment really is who we are, then the practices that we seek out and the way we relate to our practices changes, because it's not so much about seeking out these absorption states or seeking out moments of feeling high or in the flow. What we start to do is we start to bring our awareness of all the habits of mind that essentially have us programmed to go outward for things, that take us running away from ourselves. And that's a very different type of work. We're not seeking a high anymore. We're not seeking pleasure. We're actually just deepening an awareness around what's actually going on in our mind. And counterintuitively, what that does is that actually gives us more presence in our life. But by not seeking it out so much, it starts to become more and more of just a backdrop of our existence, because essentially we're gaining more of an intimate relationship with all the habits of mind that are pulling us out of it on a regular basis. And that's a much more stable platform to move through life with.
Nice one. Thank you for that. Wow, I was hearing two things there. I was hearing this first one, which I think is, when I first of all, I profoundly agree, and it was quite radical to realize that some of my use of substances was like an anxiety relief tool, and that I was like really struggling with coping with being around others and relating to others without doing this. That was really radical to me, and it also engendered some like self-compassion too, and like some understanding of like, oh, okay, this makes sense, which I think is a really cool thing to like linger on and just recognize this did fill a need, and maybe we could find a different way to fill it. that was one thing. But then the other thing, which I completely resonate with and also profoundly agree with, is that like, so I work with binge eating, just to be completely transparent. And I binge eat, I still do the spiritual practices. Like I want more and more. I just love that. It's a lot healthier, but it's not great either. It's subtly damaging more, and it creates suffering ultimately. And I can recognize that, but it still, there's like that pull. And that is like quite, it's an interesting practice, like to try to, yes, I'm thinking of it in my practice as staying with the trouble almost.
Yeah.
It's like not taking the first, obviously we don't want to be suffering and being gratuitous with it, but taking the first, like pausing a little before that first pull, like, okay, so I know you're also a Krishna Das listener, and I've committed to uh, listening to a full chant before changing. It's a very small practice, but sometimes when I'm listening to a chant, I remember another chant and I'm like, oh, I want to go to that one because it's so awesome. But just kind of waiting and saying, oh, I'm listening to this beautiful chant right now. It's great. Like, why do I need to go to the next one? It'll be there when I'm finished with this one, So I don't know if that's that, but to me, I love how you framed it. If I do feel this pull away, like towards something that I have to admit, it's a lot better than binge eating. I'm grateful. I feel it feels like progress. However, I also want to play with this idea of like just kind of resting and waiting a little bit. And do you think that connects with what you're saying about the initial stages of maybe getting into a spiritual practice after suffering can sometimes look similar and be kind of an expression of whatever that core need was filling, and then maybe with some practice and insight we could even shift from there. Yeah, I'm just kind of trying to concretize it a little bit. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. And there's nothing wrong, right, with having our needs fulfilled. And so, it's being able to have more resources often is what gives us the inner strength that we need to then do, to have those harder looks at ourselves and to be able to do so with kindness and compassion and to not be overwhelmed by what we see. Um, but yeah, I mean, I guess I'll put this in terms of the personal. I, early on in my spiritual life, I mean, I just came alive for God. I was just so deeply committed, and there was just this natural passion, right, behind practicing. And when I was living at Ram Dass's, especially when I was there as his caregiver, you know, I was chanting easily, like at a minimum, 2 or 3 hours a day, and it was often more than that. In terms of just sit down practice. And then I'm doing all my daily duties and things. And it felt so effortless. But then what happened is when I moved out of the house and I'm living with my partner and working like 3 different minimum wage jobs, and, it became harder and harder to practice like that. And there was multiple levels of suffering around that for me. One is I had built this identity around like, this is what I do. But the other I came to find over time is that after leaving his house, especially because when I was there, it did feel easy to practice like that. The way that I was continuing to practice, even though it wasn't as much as there, but the way one of the primary fuels I had to practice at a higher amount was because of this sense that I have that essentially I'm not worthy if I'm not doing blank, right? If I'm not doing enough, right? This like kind of achievement complex. And that motivation, it wasn't the sole motivation, but that was there. That was part of the fuel that was carrying me. But this is what's interesting about practice and how these systems work, is that because you're gaining a deeper understanding and acceptance of your mind, I start to become more and more aware of this. And at some point, I was even able to vocalize it. Like, yeah, I'm aware of the fact that part of the way that I'm motivating myself to practice is with this like achievement complex, right? And that's an interesting place. And I just kept doing that. And finally, what really broke around that was circumstances of my life were such that just because of how busy I was and stress and levels of suffering for various reasoning, I just was not able to practice the same way that I used to. And and it just really brought to the forefront that piece, right? Because I couldn't do it, it just made it so much more apparent how much that added layer wasn't serving me, was actually causing added suffering. And so I got to really then look at it in a deeper way and, practice letting it go. And, now I'm at a place where I feel content with the amount I'm practicing a day. And I know that, these parts of our mind don't go away. I know that's there. But going through that, it did make it so it's not running the show as much. And that enabled me to see, also to learn firsthand that there's also just the natural desire to practice exists, and that I can actually trust myself, that I don't have to let, right, this achievement complex run the show, right? Because one of my core fears was that essentially, if that wasn't active, like I would become some derelict, on the side of the road, homeless, just like addicted to masturbating or something, right? Like whatever the, like whatever the most horrible version of ourselves we can imagine, right? So, that kind of making personal what I just expressed is one of the ways that practice, no matter what our beginning motivations are, because of the way it's set up and because it's in this ecosystem of teachings, it ultimately helps us to become aware of these deeper habits of mind. And that's what grants us a greater ease of being. It's not some high state. Those come and go. But to be able to have a gentleness and ease of being that we can carry with us, even in the midst of suffering, right? Quote unquote low states, that is a true gift.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. I appreciated hearing you reflect on kind of your journey with maybe at the beginning or closer to the beginning of the path, or different times in your journey of having this kind of like exuberance and recognizing that, first of all, that's cool. Maybe there's just high energy times in life and whatever, but there's a part of that was kind of, seemed like it was motivated by like a self-critic. And there's this kind of myth, or I definitely resonate. It feels to me like a myth where, we need this, like this is the motivator, like a harsh motivation, and this is actually necessary.
Yeah.
And I'm really curious about that. It's really encouraging to hear that you've been able to let this go and you're not addicted, presumably not addicted to masturbating on the side of the road, and you're doing great and doing just fine with while letting some of that go and being more gentle. But I do think like the felt sense of that's an interesting one to confront. The great thing about the meditation practice is it's kind of designed, or it seems like, that part of it is we can see that. And so even if if we are motivated by some of that, by nature, it's kind of self-destructing, because we're able to look at it. And I'm curious, because you mentioned being with Ram Dass, which is of course very intriguing, and then circling back to absorption. I love that word that you use, because I found myself reading your book, From and For God, the poetry in it in particular. I know you talk a lot about your journey in there, but I found the poetry to be a real gift, because I got really absorbed and read it all. And that felt like really cool, because I don't think I've been lost in poetry or words like that for a while. So first of all, I wanted to thank you for that and commend your book. And I don't know, can you talk about the nature of when you're creating this poetry, absorbed? Because I found myself becoming very absorbed in it, and then certain lines I would just kind of stop. I kind of read through it pretty fast, but I would really linger on certain lines. I don't know, could you talk about the creation of those poems, and do they relate to absorption for you, or just your process with creating them? I just found them very awesome. Just wanted to ask you about your poetry. And what was it
Sure.
like creating that?
Yeah. Well, first off, thank you.
Yeah.
It feels good to hear that. I can say a couple things about it. Uh, the first is that none of the poems in that book, especially in particular, are like abstract. They all um, they all came from either specific moments in time, or specific themes that I was grappling with in terms of, suffering, um, or whatever it is. I mean, the opening poem in that book, uh, I can actually remember the exact moment that the state, that I was open to, which came from doing practice, and at that time everything was new, and so exploring those more, and how do you put something that is very intangible into words, and it's not, it's kind of like if you're in love with someone, you might write some love poetry, and then you look at it years later and you're like, oh God, right? It doesn't like land the same as when you're in the state writing it. It's meaningful to you. And so there's a whole art of how to, right? Like, how do you actually communicate something so that it can be a shared experience with someone else? And that's something that I haven't found some hard and fast rule over. It's just an intuitive feeling into. And so most of those poems, they're very short, but I probably spent days or weeks or months working on just one of them. And the act of doing that, this is the second thing I can share about it. Because however well I accomplished, the ability to communicate what I was trying to communicate, that's on other people. But I can say the effect it had on me, which is that, as a young man in this culture, I did learn how to use my intellect and my thinking mind as a way to run away from myself. And I think a lot of us have that experience, like over intellectualizing almost as like a defense against feelings. And I found it to be a really powerful act to actually turn the thinking mind inward to create a bridge so that not only could this rational verbal mind become a servant of the heart, but it can actually become a true extension of it, right? Where the ineffable has a way to titrate into words that can then be meaningful. And that's become one of my core spiritual practices. And it's so that now when I'm speaking on these things, it doesn't feel like I have to move away from the ineffable. In fact, it often requires an even closer connection. And so a lot of that process of writing that poetry was really me learning to gain a new type of relationship with my thinking mind.
That's really interesting that you say that about because I felt that. So it felt to me like you're saying you how it's this interesting thing when you write something, like how is it received, and it sounds like these poems weren't abstract to you at all. They're like almost like fossils or something, or these remnants of a very concrete experience you had. But then you did kind of shape them a little, and it did seem to transmit something like that to me, or my experience of reading them was, yeah, I like to use the word titrate, like titrating the ineffable into the linguistic, like intellectual mind. To me, it felt like a slide.
Mm.
I felt like I was sliding inwards, like they were pulling me, or I was being led inwards. I obviously I resonate with what you're saying about the mind being neither good nor bad, but it's often used, or it's used for me as a way to defend against feelings, overly intellectualize, like as some kind of a defense. Like I have this bad habit of categorizing poetry. It's like, is this a romantic poem? Is this a blah 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 type of poem? That's just a natural way I go into that habit. I did not feel that with your poems at all. I felt so I was reading them. Yeah, I was just kind of like really experiencing them. It was really quite nice experience, and it's cool to hear you talking about this idea of like not really rejecting the thinking on it. Yeah, I was feeling like it was kind of clever. It was almost deconstructing. The poem was deconstructing the mind, but also I think of this poem you have, the whale moan for love scraps, which was I think my favorite, or at least on the first read through. I thought that was really intriguing. because it kind of positions itself, or it seems to be kind of, like, don't philosophize too much. Just feel the love. That's my very simplistic interpretation of it. And but yet, it's also kind of a philosophical statement too. So it's funny like that, and that's kind of like what a poem is. It's an essay. It's a word. It's made of words, but it's bearing witness to the fact that words aren't enough for this particular subject. And I don't know. That's kind of my amateur interpretation of it. But what do you think? Do you think that's a decent reading of the whale moans? Is that kind of like what you're thinking there? And if you want to talk specifically, first of all, everyone go read this poem. But if you could talk a little bit about it, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, I do. I know this is like an old poetry trope, but I do prefer to have other people derive meanings from them. And it's because of the fact that even in writing them, sometimes I start out, maybe there is like a core idea of what it means, but then there's certain things that don't fully fit in that. And I sit in that tension for a while, and then there's just this feeling of rightness about it. And so there's just like also this trust of maybe the muse or the divine spark that, my job is really just to be in that space, and what's being communicating isn't always my job to know. And in fact, when I can let go of maybe there was a beginning intention, but if I hold on to that, if that's still there by the end of writing the poem, I'm probably not serving. It's probably not a true transmission, right, for me, and it probably isn't going to feel right to me ultimately, because there's some agenda there. But if by the end of writing it, if I've let that go, then I know I can trust that maybe there's something else coming through beyond, whatever I have up here. So I'll say that. I'm also just wondering, would you like me to just read the poem?
That would be lovely. I would love to, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure.
Yeah.
I used to never have this near, and then in some podcasts, people would ask, do you want to
Oh,
read
good.
something? And I'd be like, okay, hold on, let me go get it. So now I just have a habit of having it close by.
Lovely.
Um, and but then I can share this, right? In terms of, this is what always feels right for me to share, is in terms of whatever personal I can say about it. And so this was written specifically, I was on a plane to meet two of my dear friends and brothers in the Kirtan group Kripa that I'm a part of. For that was the first retreat that we had ever done together, and this was before the pandemic. So I was on the plane to meet them, and I read it to them at the end of the retreat, and they loved it. And at that point, I hadn't been writing poetry in a while. I kind of took a break from it, and so it was just interesting to me that two of my closest friends that essentially I knew through Ram Dass, that it was me going on my way to meet them, is what brought this inspiration to write a poem, which before, then most of the poetry I'd written was really when I was with Ram Dass on Maui. And so it kind of brought this piece back. And so that was something that was meaningful for me, just in terms of the personal relationship of it. But I will read this. Whale moans for love scraps. The poets press their faces to the love room's door, begging for scraps from that love affair. One of them catches a love-drunk whiff and cries out, Radha, Krishna. It's as if you can crawl inside of that sound and melt into electrified longing. I will tell you, the philosophers aren't even inside of that house. They hand out leaflets on the street corner and debate the meaning of muffled sounds. Is it one or is it two? Are the waves separate from the sea? But there's no riddle to unlock. No sphinx guards the gate. It swings open wildly on the winds of the lover's cry. And some of those leaflets actually say to go in. I even saw one that said, become a drunk poet and whale moan for love scraps.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Sitaram Dass. That's a real treat to hear you read that poem. Like I said, it really it really absorbed me when I read it, and that was when I really paused on. So it's cool it was amazing to hear you read it out loud. I wanted to reflect on an experience I was having this time that was different, that came through more in your words than when I was reading it. Is my first reading, I have to admit, I read it as a diss track against the philosophers, and it's like, like, hey, get off our back, we're not dualistic. But then this time I kind of caught myself with that, or not really caught myself, but to me it really evoked this kind of split in my own kind of psyche between the poet and the philosopher, and was because I definitely have that, like we were talking about with the intellectualizing. And so this one I took on more internal, and want to explore unifying those factions and making it less of a battle internally. Because I definitely, I really felt the poet, the internal poet, calling me through your reading of it. So I thank you for that. That was cool.
One thing that I've been attempting to get across in just my work in general, whether I'm on podcasts or in whatever medium, is this element of love is both the path and the reward. So what that means is that when we see that there's this element of our being that's deeper than the mind, and it's deeper than the body, and it's deeper than the thoughts and the emotions and our social roles and our name. When we see that and we rest in it deeply enough, what often happens for many of us is when we touch on something, we have a sense that we touched on something eternal, right? And that we're more than who we thought we were. But another thing that happens is that often, for many of us, if there was one word we were going to use to call what that presence is that we touched on, it would be love. And once that gets awakened, and this doesn't happen to everyone because we all have our different paths, but once that gets awakened, for some of us, what happens is that we actually fall madly in love with that ultimate reality. And once that happens, that love affair then becomes our root relationship with reality, and it becomes our primary vehicle for our awakening. So we get this sense that love is both the reward, it's the top of the mountain, right? It is enlightenment, it is whatever, and it's also the path to get there. But the way that you express love isn't through the intellect, right? It's through this devotional love poetry. It's by saying, I love you, right? That's how love gets awakened. And so there's a misunderstanding by a lot of people who are on what I would call intellectual non-dual paths, because the truth is ultimately non-dual, and some paths are more explicitly intellectually non-dual. And the people that are on those paths often don't understand that people that are on the devotional love paths, we're not so interested in it sounding intellectually correct. That what is being awakened through these love practices, through singing to Krishna, through offering a flower to our guru on our puja table, through this devotional love poetry, through saying, I love you, what's getting awakened is love, and love is a non-dual state. And we don't care if that makes sense intellectually. We're just interested in doing whatever we can to crawl into that inner essence of love. And that's the real meaning of passion. That's the real meaning of passion. And so that passion can only be awakened by seeing it. And that level of passion is only awakened through love. It's not something that can be understood or rationalized. And it's a hard thing to get across, but So I have been finding myself spending time, um, at least creating a bridge so that people who are on intellectual non-dual paths can at least have a little bit of an understanding of what these other paths are doing, and then also to create a framework so that for people who find themselves on this love affair path, um, they can have a framework so their mind can at least rest in it somewhat. Because I think it's confusing for a lot of us. Um, for whatever reason in Western culture, intellectual non-dualism is having its heyday, and I think it has to do with where our minds are at. We care a lot about having things intellectually make sense, but and I don't care what path people are on, but I just know that there's people like me that their hearts are ripe for this love-filled path. And if I can offer a little bit of an intellectual invitation that is actually okay to soften into it, then that seems like a worthwhile service.
Lovely. Thank you for that. It's very interesting that you. I was going there when reading your poem as well, and it's so cool that you bring this up and that you're on this podcast right now, because we definitely have a contingent in our group, and I wouldn't say there's a argument, but there's like a tension that is beautiful right now between. There are folks who are not wanting to practice, like they're the practice is a dualistic movement, or something like that, and I find that very intriguing and fascinating, and yeah, and this idea of, and I'm thinking of like, okay, in the spirit of building bridges intellectually, it's like it's more of a phenomenological non-dualism. It's like this feeling of, and it's so obvious, but yeah, it's like I get it when I pray to Jesus, and I
Mm-hmm.
get that, like, no, I'm not, you know, homophobic, and I think, but I just, this is what happens when I pray to Jesus, and that's just, yeah, and that's, it needs to be a statue, and I don't know why, but if you just felt this, you would get it. Um, and I can't really explain it. I like feel the need to like explain myself like I'm doing right now, like, no, and kind of protect myself from interpretations that might happen. But when I'm doing it, I'm not thinking of anything like that. It's just like,
Yeah.
this is very, very real. And it is hard to explain, and it feels like a little embarrassing almost in groups to try to bring this up. So I appreciate your project, and want to do that as well. That's why it's so cool that you're here right now. But yeah, it's so very interesting. So yeah, the devotional, and it's a bit of a paradox, that these non-dual, quote unquote, or these immersive oceanic experiences happen with devotional type practices for me,
Yeah.
and it seems like for others. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's this idea, right? This is a common one, even in devotional communities. And that's why, it's true that the map is not the territory, but um, our map allows us to either line up correctly or incorrectly to that territory. And so the type of map we have does matter. And there's an idea, even in devotional communities, that essentially um, we practice dualism until someday we don't need it, right? That's the idea, right? It's like a means to an end, but that's not actually what the teachings say, right? The devotional teachings say that love is the practice and the reward.
Right.
So and when we think about the great saints, these beings that are said to be enlightened or said to be siddhas or have experienced parama prem, that great love, they still often engage in devotional expression, right? Even people like Ramana Maharshi, who we often think is a very strictly non-dual teacher, would sing devotional love songs to, Arunchala, right? The mountain that was said to be a manifestation of Shiva. So, like, why is that? Well, what I would offer is that devotion is a natural state of our being when it is unencumbered from clinging in the mind. So, so we practice devotion ultimately so that we can crawl ever closer to that natural devotion that just is who we are. When we are in a non-dual state, it's like none of the great beings like just sat like, and did nothing. They were very active there in the world. They were doing service, right? They're helping other people awaken, right, out of their compassionate hearts, and they were expressing uh, love and devotion. And Neem Karoli Baba, a great siddha, was said to be. You could see his fingers moving all the time as he was internally doing japa, right? But for him, that wasn't a practice. That was the fruit of literally just from and for God, right? The fullness expression of just God coming out of God, and this perfect form of God is just writing God's name on a piece of paper or chanting it internally. And so there's this, so it's not that devotion is like some means to get to an end. It's that we practice devotion so that ultimately we can experience the fullness of it for devotees. For other people on other paths, it looks a little different, but we know whether we're calling it truth or we're calling it love or we're calling it consciousness, we're all going to end up on the same place.
Hopefully. Yeah. Thank you. Well, that just reminded me, it helped me circle back to something we talked about a little earlier about this like means and ends thing. I think I even brought up that term. I definitely feel that like that can be an error I think I make where it's almost like it's a bit loaded, but it's almost like, there's a symptom and the devotion is curing the symptom. It's like the pill or it's like the supplement. And that's from what I was hearing is that framing is off. It's very natural for me to go into that framing, but it's more like this is just, and I think this is where maybe the direct path non-dualism can be really helpful when it's like if and especially for me, and I'm very grateful to have found that because it did break me out of this idea of like I'm practicing from 8 to 8:30 every day, and if I don't do that, all hell is going to break loose. And it doesn't really have to be like that. It doesn't. Life is practice. Everything. Just embodying that love is. I think I did it. There was a stage of my journey where that like commitment and that habit building was probably crucial for whatever reason, or that's a story I'm telling myself. But yeah, that I think when we're talking about some of the great masters that you're talking about, there is a kind of shift, like a framing shift. That's pretty critical. And you're saying that even you've seen sometimes in devotional communities that can happen is you get this idea of like dualism is like the first stage or something, or excuse me, devotion was being dualistic in devotion is kind of a state, and later we'll kind of transcend that or something. Right. And there's no transcendence. It's just love, or that's what I'm thinking now.
Yeah. I mean, it's yeah. And so bringing in this non-dual element, especially on the devotional path, the word of Kripa, grace, is really big. And this is one of the devotional ways that we actually talk about that non-dual truth. I just had a conversation with a friend of mine a couple of days ago where they were asking about this concept of, they said to me, how do you relate to the idea that that you need to meet grace halfway, right? Essentially that we have some role to play. And I sat in that, and what I said was, well, I think that can be a useful framework at times, but it is a half-truth at best, because, and this is where we can really take a step back, if we do have a role to play, where is that desire, where is that yearning coming from, if not grace? I mean, with all of the habits of our mind, where is that yearning coming from to open up to grace more? Where is that coming from, right? If not grace. And so it's interesting because even in terms of this like practice element, as far as I can tell, all the great teachers, I mean, there's some that really don't talk about practice, but overall, by and large, people say doing some type of daily practice is important. Yeah. And at the same point, as you've pointed out, it's not some like this idea in our mind that like I have to do it here and I have to check this box and then I'll be okay, right? We have all this other stuff we bring to it. But what happens, and this is what I was pointing to earlier, is when we allow those other uh, desires, those other parts of our mind fall away, we often find that there just is a natural desire to do that practice. And where is that coming from? Right? So the desire to even yearn for God, to cry out for God, where is that going to come from except from God, right? And I've had moments, some of my deepest prayers happened where I was so lost in my stuff and suffering, right? And I was just so lost, and I just looked at a picture of my guru, and I just had one moment of just saying their name and looking at them, and in the intensity of that yearning, right, of feeling lost, that the bhav, the devotional mood, that non-dual state of love was found, not despite that intensity, but actually within the very strands of it, right? And so there's all these ways that we can conceptualize. Sometimes it feels like relaxing into it. Sometimes it feels like this forceful energy going out, a real yearning. And when we can allow ourselves to not restrain that yearning, when it just breaks all the habits of our mind, in that intensity, we find that same, what's always and already true, that same essence of love, and we can feel it within the intensity of that, right? And through practice, I mean, one of my core practices and what I often do with working with people one-on-one is learning that even in our suffering, even in our habits of mind, whatever the thought is that we can actually practice loving that as a manifestation of God, and that truth can be found even in that moment, even in the midst of that inner tension, of that pain, right? So this is always available to us. It's not some transcendent peace. It's a type of transcendence that's found within the very core of immanence itself, right? Within just all of the busyness of life is where that silence is found. It's not when that busyness falls away. Good luck trying to find that. So this grace is always present, and even our yearning for God comes from it. And so the more that we rest in that through grace, we start to learn a greater trust for ourselves, and that all that other stuff falls away naturally. And then we still do our practices because ultimately we just realize we want to.
Lovely. And so I want to, from that, do that kind of exegesis of grace and Kripa. I want to lead into your work with your organization Kripa, but before that, maybe because I kind of know where this could go potentially, but I kind of want to play, like, as we're talking about grace, and it's reminding me of what you said earlier about I'm going to use this term, like the superego or the inner critic, like letting go of that originally, or how that was a benefit to your practice. And then to this thing about grace is, I think the thing that comes up is a big discussion in our culture. I'm thinking about it a lot. It's this idea of like spiritual escape, or what do they call it? Spiritual bypassing.
Mm-hmm.
And this idea is like, well, if you just look at everything as a manifestation of grace, like, are these injustices coming from God? And should I just be devoted to things that I think are wrong or feel morally wrong to me? And I don't know if you've heard that kind of thing, because this is one thing that I get kind of stymied with. It's like, it's again, like, when I'm praying to Jesus, I feel great. But then when I'm confronted by very many injustices that are going on in the kind of institutional Christianity that I grew up in and that it's around me, and that was frankly pretty traumatizing, there's like a disconnect there. And I feel where people are coming from, especially if they aren't feeling that devotional mood in relationship to that tradition. I'm like, I get it. And and so that's, I'm kind of hearing those discussions are echoing in my mind right now. And I was wondering how you have related to things like that, maybe through your work or through your thinking or anything like that.
Yeah.
What do you think of that, Sitaram Dass?
Well, the first thing is to say that a core framework that I use when navigating all this stuff is the map is not the territory. So our ideas about the universe are not the same as the universe itself. And that's an especially important one when we're talking about something and an ineffable truth. Because what that means is that just like in reality, like in the in the physical world, just like in the physical world, if we're using a physical map, we can use a map skillfully or unskillfully, and some maps are better equipped for some situations than others. So the idea of like suffering being grace, of everything being a manifestation of God, of every moment being a perfect manifestation of the universe, those set of teachings can either be skillfully or unskillfully used. And the skillful use of those teachings is that it orients us into a deeper place of our heart, a place that both has the capacity to hold and be present with suffering and also has the natural desire to relieve it. And those teachings can actually do that. I mean, that's ultimately how those teachings work for me. But those teachings can also be used, as you said, to bypass, and you put words to that well, of what that looks like. Well, those teachings, those that I just said, that everything is a manifestation of God, that it's all grace, that takes me in the depth of my heart. But if you were to bring out any particular type of oppressive situation, violent situation, intense suffering that I see other people experience, I would never, ever call any of that perfect or good, right? My natural response, especially if I was face to face with it, should be, and I would hope would be, to want to relieve it, right? Because that's what comes out of that non-dual state, right? That who we are is a being of compassion and love and service. And that's what these devotional practices should be waking us up to if they're working. So those teachings of everything being grace, they serve to deepen me into my heart, my natural heart. And this natural heart has a natural desire to relieve suffering and to end oppression, and ultimately does not feel okay with the way that we're doing things in the world and wants to change it, right? And I can be at home, I can be present with that pain if I'm in contact with my spiritual heart. Most of how we spend our time is to run away from feeling pain. And that means that most culturally, we're running away from being able to feel the pain of the world. And we cannot relieve that suffering if we're constantly running away from it. We have to be deeply at home and present with it. And as we are, there's a natural desire to relieve it. So that's the best way that I can answer that question.
Nice one. Thank you. Thank you for that. I love this idea of like the skillful means, especially when we're talking about like this moment where, and so we're recording this in 2022. It's such like a blessing to have all these resources, but you can now like get access to like these spiritual insights. And there's this whole phenomenon, I think in the Buddhist tradition, they call it dry insight, where it's like you go right to like everything is emptiness. And you can just read that on like a Wikipedia page and you can just sit with that. And you don't go through like the pedagogy that the people who came up with, the masters who transmitted that, have said, well, you know, you should really have a strong energy body and really, you know, get into loving kindness. Like you can bypass that just because of this amazing infrastructure we have now, which is really cool, but there also are dangers associated with it. And I just, when I learned that, I first heard that phrase skillful means out of Buddhism. And I think this is like so fascinating to me. I'm kind of taking us on a tangent here. I apologize, but it's just like, for me, I have like what I call a Santa Claus trauma, where I learned that, you know, I was lied to about Santa Claus, and I really don't want to be like tricked at all. And this has held me back on, and I think it could be cultural, maybe it's just me, but it's like, I don't want to have like the wool pull over my eyes. And so like, it's almost like I don't want to accept someone who's giving me like good advice about like, hey, like stay away from this like do things skillfully. And I think that's why for me, like the direct path non-duality is very enticing, because I don't want to be tricked. Anyways, that's how I was relating to your skillful means thing on a bit of a tangent. However, this thing about, I think it's just so cool, like this natural, and I do want to apologize to the audience, to you, Sitaram Dass. I did not think this was going to turn into like me preaching about Jesus the whole time, but I just think of like, we just talk about mythology, like safely as a myth, like what a beautiful symbol of this, the worst, you couldn't really imagine a worse situation like than the crucifixion, like completely unjust. All the hope that people would have had for a savior, and for that to be just kind of thrown away so carelessly, and yet like Mary Magdalene's able to witness it, and Jesus is able to bear this thing, and the story goes that like this is salvation. I think there's something very powerful just from the very secular mythic interpretation about that. Of course, no one is going to say that that was the right thing to happen, but yet something about the acceptance of it blossomed like this, just on a completely secular level. It's kind of this movement of people that has flourished all over the place, and people are singing devotional Christian songs in like Malaysia. And it's like, whoa, like how does this happen? And of course, like something we love, like Neem Karoli Baba, and I think there is a cool connection in the Bhakti tradition. But anyways, yeah, I really love how you talked about the skillful means there, and something about non-duality really it can engender a kind of morality, like a very authentic, potent morality. Yeah.
Well, and that's just it, because one of the things that we learn through practice is that these quote unquote morals are actually our heart's natural desire. And that's a really powerful place. And that's what allows us to let go of the inner critic. I mean, it can still be allowed to be there, but we just learn that we don't actually have to listen to it, right? Just like any other person in our life, sometimes it says good things. Sometimes the inner critic criticizes things and it's good, but we have choice. I can choose to listen to it or not, because sometimes it says things that are just way off base, right? But before we have access to our heart's natural desire, it feels really scary to think that we have choice to listen to it or not, because we don't know what that's going to mean, right? And I brought up the metaphor of me on the side of the street, derelict, just addicted to masturbating, right?
Yeah.
Whatever it is for people, right? This fear, right? And you brought up the super ego, right? And it serves a function, but one exercise I've done a lot with people, and I wrote about it in the book, is just asking someone after meditating for a bit, what do you want?
Mm.
And the idea is you say it over and over again. And the person who's asking just simply says thank you to whatever the person said. And the idea is, after a while, you start to go through your pre-programmed responses, and you get to this essence of, you don't know what you're going to say even the moment before you say it. And when you get to that moment, what comes out is really beautiful, and it actually ties into this element of grace and free will, and because it's what you want, but where did it come from? Yeah? Where did that come from? And what we find through that practice is that ultimately, yeah, we want to actualize our potential in some way, but that involves usually being a part of community, being a part of service, serving others. Like, we actually deeply want to be kind to others. We want to tell the truth. We actually want to. We have fears about doing it, but the reason why these teachings are so universal and why they're so resonant for us is because in our heart of hearts, we want to do that, because we know that that leads to freedom, right? So love, truth, kindness, compassion, selfless service, we want that. We actually want that. And learning that we can trust ourselves on the spiritual path, we can even trust our desires.
Mm.
That is the powerful moment of awakening on the path. And it helps bring in a different element of gentleness.
Yeah, it's so intriguing. I'm glad you circled back to this, like being able to trust the like inner desires. To me, that just, so in the kind of addiction space that I'm living in and working in, we have this term like recovery, And as we're doing meditation, it's like recovery of what? We get into this like real sticky kind of conversation, like what is being recovered? And someone posed that question to me, and it kind of threw me, because I know I shouldn't say like myself, like, because there is no self, like we know this, right? Like this is what they're putting me in that trap. And but I've been framing it in my own practice as recovering, trusting my intuition,
Uh-huh.
because like differentiating like what I was doing that was harming myself from like the authentic call towards beauty and love. And that's, I think that's, there's almost a skepticism that arises, to be honest. Like I don't trust that. And I'm curious if
Yeah.
you could think back maybe on your journey, if you could go back like to the moments or the days or the weeks before you kind of had this realization, that something inside you is calling you to love, and you don't need to kind of beat yourself over the head with practice to get there. Because I'm just
Yeah.
imagining folks in the audience who maybe haven't had that experience yet. And what can we do? What can we, like, if you were to give yourself a counsel back then, what would you say? Like, what would be a good step? What would be something good to try? I love the practice. Maybe we should just try what you were doing with that. What do you want? Sounds like maybe a good way, but if that's it, or if anything else arises for you, what do you think about that? Folks who maybe want to get to that place.
Yeah. Well, none of this has to be all or nothing. And the way that we learn trust is through testing it. And we don't have to gamble what we're not willing to lose. So it's like with telling the truth, right? I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to go up to the next stranger I see and tell them my deepest, darkest secret that I feel all the shame around. That's, I don't need to do that. And the more that we practice these things, the more that we learn experientially in an embodied sense in our own nervous system, in our own minds and bodies, that it's okay. And it can just be bit by bit, right? There's some, we find that there's some truths that are hard for us to express, and maybe we skirt around it a little bit. Our whole life we've been really dancing, but then we start dancing a little bit closer, and it starts to get hotter, and then finally we find some safe community where we're able to practice it in a more real way, and then we feel that moment of freedom, and we learn that it's okay. And through this practice, I mean, I'm starting with telling the truth, so I'll just continue with this, right? And then we start to become awares of all the ways that we're trying to craft other people's perceptions of us, and it feels really scary to let that go. But little bit by little bit, we practice telling the truth as a practice, not because there's some perfect ideal that we have to judge ourselves based on, but because the practice itself is a path to freedom. And it starts to loosen the holds. And essentially what happens is, as we gain the experience of having greater ease of being, greater inner freedom through telling the truth, we start to learn that we don't actually have to protect ourselves as much as we thought that we did. And it also changes the relationship with it. Yeah, maybe we're still not telling our whole truth at all the times because we recognize that we're in a world and maybe there's things that actually aren't safe to say. Okay, fine. But that's different, though. That's very different than, like having some boundaries that are very strategically placed for purposes that we're deeply aware of, is very different than just this really old storyline that says it's not safe for people to see us who we are, right? And we can't get in that place of being able to place boundaries deliberately unless we're really deeply aware of all the habits, all the ways we've essentially created walls so that people can't see us. So that's like one element of practice and how we essentially learn that it's okay. And the more we do that, the more that we learn that we can trust ourselves, right? That these things work. And so whether we're getting more in contact with our desires, I mean, I'd love to hear you speak to this. I mean, I imagine for the majority of people starting in the addiction journey, being distrustful of your desires, it might be skillful in the beginning a little bit, because you're not actually aware at that point of like what desires you can trust or not. I imagine, I mean, following desires in some sense can lead to addiction. Um, so yeah, I guess I'm curious to hear from you. How does that, how has your been experience of that, just in terms of being involved in addiction communities, um, in those beginning stages where it feels like you can't trust yourself, and how do you navigate that as you simultaneously work to gain trust?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. Um, First of all, thanks for your answer. There's a lot of very, very interesting like ideas in there in what you were saying about almost like lowering the stakes. Like it was inviting me to be like less black and white about it, like with telling the truth. And maybe this will be a good segue into answering your question. It's like there's this with telling the truth. There's often like maybe some trauma coming out of addiction, and there might be a desire to to talk about like I really want to love you, but I can't because you hurt me, and this is like such a big thing to say, and it's really overwhelming. And like you don't necessarily have to do that, like to have a spirit of telling the truth, like to start, like you can, like for me, like in a group setting that's very safe and everyone's consented to being vulnerable. Okay, so for telling the truth, I want to be more intimate, not only with like my partner, but with like people I'm not attracted to that I really love, that I like really love. And I want to say, I love you. I care so much, but I feel a lot of fear doing that. And in a group setting that's organized around, mental health and recovery, it's very safe to do that. We have boundaries and we can just do that and just practice there and really live in that. And then it starts to build like a scaffolding. That was really beautiful in how you said that. I love how you talked about telling the truth, because I think that's a really charged one and it's very relevant to me. Anyways, your specific pointed question about desire and addiction, it's kind of stymies me. It's like one of those things where there's a conflict between like the evidence, like the concrete evidence, and some of the things I want to believe, or the way I'm interpreting certain teachings that my essence is love. Like it really seems like there's a desire to hurt myself. Like what I get wrapped up in like the psychoanalysis thing, but it seems like a drive. And actually, Buddha talks about this too, of a death drive, a thirst to hurt. It's really tough. It's tough to deal with. I think one very common way is just to internalize an external framework, a morality, like a 12 step, and say,
Mm-hmm.
this is the truth. And like, if it isn't aligned with this, then it's harmful. I think that's ultimately, if we can get over what I call the Santa Claus, because it's not the truth. It's too rigid, and it's not the truth, and it's very restrictive. That can feel very secure though at that point.
Yeah.
But so and that's a tough one, because you can really get wrapped into it. What I like to try to do in my life and folks I'm working with is create a framework like that that's very flexible and very personalized. Like, okay, there's I talk about this thing called like how far is this action remote from my values? Like if I'm
Mm-hmm.
in a good place and I can put my values, like, well, if I'm like using and like lying to my partner, like I want to be trustworthy and I want to be in a committed relationship. So this is not a good activity. And if my desire is telling me to do it, then something is off with that. And we can have compassion about that. But if it's pulling me away from this thing I know, and so that just has to be like externalized in those states. And then there just luckily some of the neuroscience and stuff is coming online and confirming stuff we have in the spiritual tradition. It was like, yeah, the brain can change, and we can identify these neural pathways, and they are malleable, and it just takes some practice. And it's like, it can be overwhelming, but it's also like, it's trying to unlearn. So you play the harmonium, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like imagine trying to unlearn how to play the harmonium, or unlearn how to play a bike or ride a bike. It's like, whoa, I have to do that. So if you have to unlearn how to do a coping mechanism, that's a thing. Like that's no small thing. And we gotta kind of say, hey, I'm gonna need support through this, and it's possible, but it's a project. So anyway, so that's I really
Yeah.
appreciate the chance to reflect on that question. I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but I think that is why something like the 12 steps develop, is because we need a framework to readjust ourselves.
And this points to actually something really beautiful, because we can say the same thing about all spiritual traditions, right? They're offering a framework, but ultimately, I mean, the way that you just put words to that, like unlearning how to ride a bike, that that sounds seemingly impossible. So this is an interesting thing. What is going to draw someone to try to attempt to do that, right? Where is that coming from except within them somewhere? And even if we're picking a particular framework, it's our own intuitive heart. Even if we don't totally know, even if we're having doubts shouted everywhere, there's some still small voice that's saying, hey, let's try this out. Yeah, we need to do something different. Let's try this out. This seems to work for other people. Let's try this out and see. Yeah. And that, when we can awaken that, when that can be pointed out a little bit, then even earlier on in our journey, even is there as there is all this distrust, and as we are externalizing things, ultimately we can also connect that it's our own intuitive heart that is we are choosing to engage in this. And and that's a powerful thing. And that's what I mean when I say that in our deepest heart, in our deepest desires, that's grace talking to us. That is the guru talking to us through our own desire, through our own inner voice. Because otherwise, why would anyone try to unlearn how to ride a bicycle, right? You know, unless there was some deeper need. And what it connects to, and you also spoke to this well, in terms of these deeper values, ultimately that we feel satisfied when we're aligned with those values. And it takes time for us to really see this, but those values do not come up here.
Mm.
And people don't have to believe me right now, but they don't. Here's one clear example. Right now, you could imagine, like anyone listening could imagine a moment where you just imagine yourself doing something horrible to someone, right? Maybe you're so mad at them and you just punched them, or you said something awful, but in that moment you didn't do that, right? That's that value to not do that. Yeah, sometimes we experience some other voice saying, "Oh, don't do this," but
Mm-hmm.
we've also most of us have had the experience of having thoughts saying one thing and then doing something different,
Mm-hmm.
making another choice, and that helps point to the fact that these values, however you want to conceptualize them, for me in my spiritual worldview, those values come from God. They come from the essence of reality itself, or the truth of interdependence. But even if you want to have a secular humanistic framework, that's fine. But regardless, we all intuitively know that those values don't come from the messages up here. These messages can either be aligned or not aligned with these values, but we're connected to them despite this.
Yeah, lovely. Yeah, I think the question of values and where they come from, it's if we are on a more of an intellectual path, that can lead down a really interesting rabbit hole. I mean, it's a fascinating question, and I like that example of the yeah, thinking of something, the idea of thinking of something, and then thinking back to maybe memories of the embodied experiences like hurting someone. I mean, those are just so qualitatively different. There's like an infinite gap between them. Um, Lovely. Um, Sitaram Dass, you've been extremely generous with your time. I'd like to thank you for that. If it's all right with you, do you have time for one more question? We have a traditional question I like to ask.
Sure.
Do you think we could end with that?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So it's a bit of a trick question. I have to apologize in advance. And it's probably more my responsibility to answer this than yours, but I'll pose it to you. Sitaram Das, why are we here? What are we doing here, like in this interview? Why? What is this all about?
Mm-hmm. So I'm hearing in that there's the broader question, like why are we here? But then also in this moment, right, how does that broader question relate to this moment? Well, I'll share two things. One is that I think for people where the answer to that question feels important to them, the drive to uncover what that is for them is probably more important than any one answer that they're going to find from anyone. But I will also share what feels to me in this moment is my truest, deepest answer. When I first met Ram Dass, I had a desire. At that point, I was 23 years old, and basically I was willing to just give everything up to be with him. I, that's all I had figured out. I didn't know what I wanted to do with my time, or I just I knew that I felt the connection with him, and that if there was some chance to work with him in some way, I was willing to do it. So I make my way. I have a chance, and I get to visit him in Maui, and this is expressed to him, and as well as my entire story and all these things. And he simply said one thing. He said, well, you should know that no one comes in front of me unless Maharaji, his guru, sent them. Now, his guru died, left his body in 1973. And, I met him in 2011, something like that, 2010 maybe. So he was talking about different level of understanding reality. And I didn't understand it quite at that moment. But from living at the house with him, I got to see from him, I was granted an invitation into that same worldview where I saw he literally lived in a universe where everything was the Guru's grace. And every single person that came before him, his own wheelchair, his stroke, the pain in his body, it was all the grace of the Guru. And that was the universe he lived in, right? Ram Dass also, through his entire life, was extremely committed to service. So this was not a spiritual bypass. Mm. And Ram Dass had extreme physical pain in his body, like nerve pain, just all of these issues because of the stroke and being in a wheelchair, not being able to move his body and being in his 80s, right? So when he talked about loving his pain, that was something he had earned, right? This was not a bypass. This was both an active practice, love as a practice, and love as a state. He was able to rest in that love while experiencing suffering, and he saw that suffering as a manifestation of God. It's said of Hanuman, Hanuman is a deity, said to be a monkey god, and is said to experience perfect service and devotion. Well, Hanuman is 100% devoted to Sitaram, Hanuman's chosen name and form of God. But Hanuman also is in the place where Hanuman sees Sitaram in the entire animate and inanimate universe. Every blade of grass, every single being, every sentient being, Hanuman sees all of it as a manifestation of God and then wants to serve it in that mood. Well, I got to see from Ram Dass a human being embody that and practice that. And I was invited into that worldview. And so I started to allow that to be my own worldview. And that was one of Ram Dass's gifts for me is what we call Guru Kripa, where the reason why I'm here with you is because of the Guru's grace. And that's why we're talking. And that's what this conversation's about. And this is about, for me, deepening my own path. It's deepening my own relationship with the essence of my being, with the essence of reality. It's deepening my own relationship with my own natural desire to love and to serve and to remember God.
Thank you. Wow, lovely. Thank you for tackling that question. Beautiful to weave in some of your experiences with Ram Dass and how that invited you into that beautiful worldview of the Guru Kripa. And thank you. I think that's a lovely way to end our podcast. I do, before we say goodbye, Sitaram Das, want to ask you, like, if for folks who are watching or who are with us, if they're interested in like some of your work you do one-on-one, or your work with the Sacred Community Project, which is just so exciting. We didn't get to talk much about that, but it's such a cool thing you're doing. And if you want to talk a little bit about that, and maybe find your book and the amazing things you're doing, like where can we go to connect with you further?
Yeah. Well, I will be sure to send you all the links and all of
Great.
that. But, you know, my name, sitaramdas.com, is a good way to find me. The nonprofit service group that I'm a part of, sacredcommunityproject.org. That's what houses all of the service projects that I'm involved in. And really at this point, pretty much all of my offerings serve as fundraisers for that. And the Sacred Community Project, its core mission is to lower the barriers of access to contemplative and devotional practices. So one of our main offerings now, this has been a pivot during COVID. Before COVID, we were going into a lot of prisons, with the Kirtan group. I'm a part of Kripa. We would go into prisons and offer Kirtan there. But now with COVID, we've had to do a lot of reframing of things. And one beautiful thing that's come out of that is doing online one-on-one spiritual support. And so that's something that is offered through the Sacred Community Project. Anyone that reaches out, either through email, phone, or video chat, is offered spiritual support primarily for me. And it's entirely donation based. This is offered for free. And if people have the means and feel inspired to give at the end, then that goes towards, funding our other service projects. And so that's just one element there. And that's also a good home to find my book, From and For God, or you can go to fromandforgod.com and to find more info about the Kirtan group I'm a part of, Kripa. Yeah, so that's really what's feeding me right now. I mean, it's really my deepest passion is building this container to allow the spiritual teachings to be disseminated in other ways beyond our kind of normal, quote unquote, free market capitalist framework.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're attempting to build with this.
Wow. So yes, as Sitaram Das said, we'll make sure to provide those links in wherever you find this interview. And I just want to say, Sitaram Das, really grateful for your time. Very stimulating, very interesting, and very moving conversation. So thank you for offering that to us, and for what you're doing for the world as well, lowering the barriers to contemplative practice. Thank you for that.
Yeah. No, thank you for inviting me. This has been a real joy. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And hope you have a great day, and we'll see everyone next time. All right.
Okay.